So, good evening and welcome. My name's Natasha, Conland. I'm the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Auckland Art Gallery, and it's my real pleasure to have join with us on Zoom this evening an associated talk for the Walters Prize. These are a series of talks we've organised as guests of the artists. So tonight we have artist Sriwhana Spong from the 2021 Walters Prize and Professor Adrian Vickers, who is Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Sydney. And as Adrian has said, has been researching Balinese art for nearly 45 years. And additionally, set up the virtual museum of Balinese painting. Sriwhana's installation in the Walters Prize, the Painter-tailor, centres around the somewhat absent subject of Justi Rundu, her grandfather, who was born in 1918 and died in 1993. So one of the really special things about this evening's talk is an opportunity to hear from you, Adrian, a bit more of a context for this artist, who's also the subject of inquiry of Sriwhana's film. The film starts with a scene of dogs languishing, which could equally be a scene from a painting in some respects. 3 dogs languishing and creating a kind of a triplet of interest. We see a painting sort of rippling on the wall, and later family members bring the painting out into the courtyard. We would really love to hear from you, your perspective on that painting and how you see it fits into this man's career, and particularly the importance it might hold for the family, which is also a subject of the film's inquiry.
So thank you, and kia ora. Yeah, it's a great honour to join you for this occasion, both as a fan of the gallery, but also because I'd been doing research on Balinese artists who began working in the 1930s, and I'd done a lot of research on Sriwhana's grandfather, and then she emailed me and said she was working on this film, and I was really bowled over by the opportunity to make contact with her. So yeah, Justi Rundu was one of those really interesting men that he was as part of a group of Balinese who came from really humble backgrounds. They at the time when they got interested in creating art, they were really, the island was reasonably impoverished, and fortunately this was also the beginning of a tourist boom. And what is quite significant is that in the 1930s, when Justi Rundu was still, I guess he started working as an artist when he was still a teenager, and then into his early 20s, that local people in this village of Sanur in South Bali had the opportunity to convert traditional art into something that they could make a living from tourism. So let me just start. I'll share my screen here. We can start with the work that's the subject of this wonderful little film, and this is that's a work that I'll talk about in a moment. But this is the main work that is talked about in the film, or shown in the film, and one of the few remaining pieces that has stayed in Sanur. And most of the art that Justi Rundu and his relatives and his fellow villagers produced in the 1930s has disappeared into museums or private collections, and a lot of people don't really have access to it. But this work is quite distinctive, this large work here, partly because it's of its subject matter, but also in the way that it's done. So most of the artworks that we have from Gusti Rundu were done on a fairly small scale, often on paper, usually A4 size paper, and showing single scenes from different mythological episodes. But this work is a very large work, and it seems to have been one of his last works, or works that he did later in life. And unlike a lot of the work that he produced, it was done for the family, but also as something that could equally serve as an artwork to adorn a temple ceremony. And it's done in the style and format of traditional paintings that are used within ritual contexts. And I think that's one of the significant things about it. But also the subject matter is quite dramatic. It's hard to get a sense of it, but it's made up of multiple details. But it's from an ancient Hindu myth, the story of Boma, who was a demon, but a son of the god Vishnu, and so powerful that he threatened the whole world and the whole universe, and the gods had to more or less gang up against him to defeat him. And the painting itself shows the battle between Boma and the gods, and we see Boma on the bottom right corner there with the guy with the multiple heads, this very fearsome figure, and all of these other amazing cosmic symbols realized in this artwork. So it's quite profound. It speaks to ancient Balinese traditions that stretch back to India, and it's something that he didn't depict much in his other work. There's only one other painting, which I've shown here on the left next to it, and I only know this other work through a catalogue. A painting of a similar story of mythological scenes, and this story of the death of Boma. Most of his other work was much what we might call lighter and decorative, because it was done for different audiences and different purposes. So I'll return to the main work in a second, but I just wanted to illustrate a few of his other artworks. So in the 1930s, something like a few dozen painters and artists, craftsmen from the village of Sanur started using their talents in making these really splendid little artworks for sale to tourists, but also for, I guess, general purposes. And when they talked about it, they would talk about these artworks as iseng, as something you did for fun. These were fun works. These were experimental works. What's always struck me about this artwork is that these were young people who were experimenting with different styles and coming up with their own forms of modern art. So this is from a series of works that Gusti Rundu and his brother-in-law, Sukarya, so Sriwhana's uncle, they worked together, and they did this series of works from dramatic stories. There was a popular form of dance drama called Arja, and it had all kinds of fantastical, legendary stories that they would use. So what Gusti Rundu and his brother-in-law and other family members did was to take a whole lot of these stories and do multiple scenes of them, showing these quite amazing stories. This one is actually from a Middle Eastern story called Ahmad Muhammad, and it's about these brothers who have all these experiences in magic places. And Gusti Rundu and his brother-in-law were able, in rendering this, to take these stories from outside and to turn them into very Balinese stories. So we see here a traditional Balinese pavilion with a curtain around it, and that's how people slept in traditional buildings. This is just called a bale, a bit like the Polynesian word fale. It's part of a residence. But in this story, there's all kinds of adventures that people have with magical animals, including here we see Ahmad and his elephant that he rides on. And then later on, there's a flying horse and encounters with a magic queen who's a kind of queen of the witches. And let me go back. And in these stories, we have all a range of different displays, not just of gender relations, but of, I guess, the cultural, a collected cultural imagination of Bali. And that's why I've always found these works quite fantastic. So this is part of a series of works that have legendary stories, but later on in the 1930s, Gusti Rundu and his collaborators also got together and did works which moved from the storylines into different kinds of abstract work. And I think you can see that already happening to some degree in this artwork, which has such an amazing composition. He's taken that landscape, and then the way he's fitted the horse in and the use of clothing and so on. It's just a really exciting work. And then later on, what he developed it into was a series of images of animals in the landscape. Here we see pigs, which are a big part of Balinese life, I guess, like Polynesian life as well. Pigs and a goat sort of hanging around a pond, but the interweaving of the animals is one of the really clever things about this composition. And then added to that was the use of colour, although significantly when these guys worked. So Gusti Rundu did the sketching and then the overlaying with ink washes, but it was actually one of his neighbours, a guy called Picha, who added the colour. So there's a sense of collaboration that comes out of this, and a very communal attitude to interaction and making artwork together. And Gusti Rundu carries this over into these really, really more and more complex compositions that he develops throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. Now, what I mentioned before, that there are these young artists who get the opportunity to make a living out of art in the 1930s because of the tourist boom. And there were dozens and dozens of people who got involved in this. And Gusti Rundu is really one of the best of those. He's one of the top artists. But what's also significant is a lot of the other artists stopped work in the 1930s and 1940s at the beginning of World War II, when opportunities dried up and they had to find other ways to make a living and so on. But Gusti Rundu actually continues painting. He really becomes an artist and is really devoted to art. So we know from other collections that his artwork continues right into the 1950s and 1960s, building on these earlier kinds of creations and compositions. But then he returns to traditional form in these final works in his later years. And that really intrigues me, that in some ways his development as an artist is from these really innovative, exciting modern creations, modern style creations, into a search that takes him back to tradition, but it takes him to mythology, and it takes him to the really meaningful parts of Hindu religion. So I think that just gives you a little bit of context about the film, because this painting is a centerpiece of the film, but it also tells us that in this domestic scene, in that beautiful courtyard where the film is and where the dogs are hanging out, that there's also something quite profound going on in the artwork at the same time. So yeah, that's a little bit by way of introduction.
That was fantastic, thank you. Really amazing introduction to the context. It was occurring to me too, from a point of really an introduction to that environment in the 30s. Who were the tourists predominantly who were going, and what was it about their experience that led them to seek artworks rather than other kinds of mementos? I'm thinking, what was the stimulus for the art scene in that time?
Okay, yeah, they're really good questions. So initially the tourists were just Dutch, and they, because this was, the Dutch were the colonial rulers. This was still, Bali was still part of the Netherlands East Indies, and they would initially come down from the north. They would catch boats to the port of Singaraja and then hire cars, and somebody would drive them down to the south. But then by the 1930s, they'd actually widened the harbour of South Bali to create a landing port where people could bring cruise ships. So you actually had cruise ships coming in, and there was a really broad range of people on those cruise ships. By the 1930s, there were quite a few Americans, Australians were going up there. I imagine some New Zealanders as well. And Bali got a reputation because of the art and because of the richness of its culture as the place to go. So some of these tourists were some of the well-to-do of the world, some famous people. I guess one of the most famous people of the 1930s was Charlie Chaplin.
Oh, wow.
Visited there. So that's the kind of people who would come there, and where the port was, where the cruise ships would come in and people could be offloaded from the cruise ships, was actually in the area of Sanur, or just north to the village of Sanur. So a couple of enterprising Germans set up a shop, like a tourist shop, where the tourists would come in, and they sold artworks like this and carvings as well. So that seemed to be how they set up that market for that particular kind of artistic souvenir, recognizing that you had these amazingly talented people around the village that they could draw on. And these German brothers, they're known in Balinese legends as the Fish Brothers, Tuan Bay, because they had an aquarium that was one of the attractions. But they got to know local people and looked at their artworks and worked out who the talented ones were, and that's how they drew people in. But they had a lot of these tourists coming through their art shop there, so that was part of the linkage.
Sriwhana, do you have a question there in relation to that scene that Adrian's depicting?
Not so much in relation to that, but I would love, I was really curious, Adrian, when we were emailing about the painting. It was probably quite a few years ago now. And I remember reading in your book, I've actually got it here.
Okay, great, thank you.
And which is fantastic. And I remembered reading about, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Ayonayon in Kamasan painting, which you write about as representing dust particles and haze, and this idea that I guess there's no such thing as empty space, they're kind of energy fields, I guess. And I'd love you to talk a bit more about that, because what I found really interesting in the painting of Gustirundus was what looked like Ionayon had actually turned into insects.
Yes,
And
yes, yeah.
yeah, and so there's this kind of interesting thing where you were talking about him returning to tradition, but at the same time he's kind of returning to the traditional myths, but taking this kind of, I guess, exploration of animals or at the animal world with him. And yeah, I'd love you to talk about that if possible.
Yeah, no, I think that sense of playfulness that comes through in so much of his other work, that sense that you can experiment and add things, and that doesn't really take away from the seriousness of it, but it's really just a matter of being able to take these elements and I guess stick within the traditional constraints. Like there are sort of rules for proportion and how you depict gods and that kind of thing, but within that still be able to bring idiosyncratic touches. So yeah, the painting itself is incredibly busy. There's so many things. It's multiple scenes, and you can imagine this great cosmic battle where all of these different forces are involved with. We can think about, you know, armies of demons and armies of gods. So all of that comes into the bustlingness of the scene, the busyness of the scene. But yeah, then you still have to fill the empty spaces with these air motifs or dust particles as well. But then they turn into their own kind of magical creatures. I think that sense of the animation of everything, that everything around you is kind of spiritually charged, or you have different forces that make themselves visible, but they're there in invisible ways otherwise, is important. And maybe that's also part of that thing of the interaction of nature and the way that people live, that there's not clear distinctions. And I think the film with the dogs kind of has that. It actually made me think of there's an ancient Hindu myth in the Adiparwa, which some traditional artists show, where there was one of the kings was holding a great ritual, and a dog came through, and the king's brother kind of hit the dog to chase it away. But then it turns out the dog was actually a goddess, and the king's brother gets cursed for hitting the dog. It's like, no, dogs are actually more than dogs. They could be something else. So they're part of life as well, and they could be part of a ritual event, even though they just look like they're hanging out.
Yes, it's a lovely cycle in Sriwhana's film, with the beginning scene of the dogs and then it finally returning to a different kind of conversation with her father about the plight of being an artist, and why does Justirundu paint animals so much, and he describes the home with the dogs around and his affection and fondness. So it reminds me, because, you know, through many eyes, a scene like that in a painting seems like it's from a faraway land, or faraway time, you know, as you say, recalling traditional styles of painting going back hundreds of years, but there's something of the everyday connecting into the work, which is very interesting to think about how the work might diversify through what's around. Yeah.
I mean, I also kind of, Adrian, in your book as well, and I guess talking about how the environment might enter, or this, I was also interested where you talk about how works are often painted on laps, and so this idea where you have this kind of like viewpoint, which is kind of a multiple viewpoint of a scene, and it's painted in kind of sections, I guess. And I was really interested in how perhaps like the way the body is used to paint might affect the composition, or like I imagine if you're painting something on a lap, you focus on a lap-sized scene, and I really liked this relationship that I imagined of composition to the body. And I wondered if maybe you could talk a bit more about that, or yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, well, maybe that's also partly linked to that idea that there is a communal aspect, and you see Balinese artists in traditional contexts, they're working in open areas with a whole lot of people around. So it's not that thing of an artist goes and closes themselves off in the studio and, you know, nobody's allowed in. That there is a much more social aspect to it, but then also, yeah, that rather than having something up on a frame, that you just take this large piece of cloth and you work on it bit by bit, and that is really quite amazing, because then that means that the artist has to have something in his or her head about what the whole thing is going to look like, even though it's realized in pieces. But because sorry.
Oh, no, sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking, how would the work have literally been planned? There would have been no sketching in advance?
Oh, no, there was, yeah, you lay it out and you go around and sketch, but still you're sketching bit by bit and bring in the elements. So you would sort of take a corner at a time and work through that and then come out with it. So it is a much more difficult task to come up with that kind of complex arrangement of bodies and elements there. And it does, there's I don't know, when you're in Bali, there is, you know, it's like going to a ritual and so on, and nobody's quite sure. It feels like nobody's quite sure what's going on. There's a lot of things happening, but then somehow it just happens and everything comes together in a quite amazing and very beautiful way. And I feel like the artwork's like that as well, that there's something being realized in a painting that's actually much larger and much more shared on a community level.
So, you know from having seen the film also that the figure of Claire Holt also emerges in the film, in particular her photographic album, and it's quite a it's not a shock, but it's an estranging experience to see all the different versions of this man, and then suddenly to see an actual photograph taken, well, presumably, if not by her, someone she's near to and collected in the album. Can you give us a bit of context about what her interest would have been in the Sinua area at the time? She is a dance historian as well as an art historian and anthropologist. And what would she be seeing at that time of the album, do you think?
Okay, that's quite a finder, because I hadn't seen that photograph until it appeared there, and then because I'd seen some of the other ones in her collection, and I've seen her archive at Cornell University. So she's one of a number of incredibly colourful characters who turned up in Bali in the 1930s, but she's one of the rare ones who followed up. So she went back to Bali in 1955 and 56 when those photographs were taken, and she purchased one of one of his paintings as well. So she'd originally gone to Indonesia, to Java and Bali, being interested in dance, and she did documentation of dance, but there she also fell in love with a Dutch archaeologist, Stoeterheim, and so through Stoeterheim she met a whole lot of people doing research on Bali, and that included the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead and her husband Gregory Bateson, and some of the other people living in Bali. So when Claire Holt was there in the 1930s, she already met a whole lot of these Balinese artists, and I'm fairly sure she would have met Gusti Rundu at that stage. And then after the break of the war, she was actually moved to the US, worked in a State Department, and then worked in Cornell University. Then she went back to do this field survey, and it became part of a really landmark book on Indonesian art, probably the first real study that bridged ancient and modern Indonesian art. And so as part of her fieldwork, she then went back to the people that she'd known in the 1930s to see what they were doing. And her field notes are full of all of these jottings about, who had died and what had happened to other people, because some of the artists, for example, ended up fighting for Indonesia's freedom in the revolution and died in those contexts, or there were all kinds of other things that happened to them. And we get some of that story, and the album is a glimpse of a whole set of other stories that she's brought together. But yeah, the visit in the 50s was part of the creation of this landmark book, which is still a standard reference for talking about Indonesian art and the history of Indonesian art. And it's kind of nice to think of these foreigners. So people, and Margaret Mead was the same, that the people who'd been there in the colonial context of the 1930s came back in post-colonial to independent Indonesia, and they still had really close contact with a whole lot of Indonesians, that they had built up relationships or renewed relationships that continued on in this period. So it does say a lot about intercultural relations and I guess the building up of mutual respect through art, which, given the earlier colonial circumstances, was something also that was not the norm.
Mm. She's making a case for the special place of art and Balinese culture at that time. But would she have been collecting artworks to take back to the States? Yeah,
so she did have a little art collection. In her album, there's photographs of, she took photographs, and she had another photographer take photographs in Jakarta, but she took photographs of a whole lot of things. So we know that she had at least one Gusti Rundu in her own private collection, most of which I think is now in Cornell University's gallery. So she collected her own works, but she also was trying to make a record of a whole range of other artworks.
Sriwhana, the title, I wondered if we should talk about the title of your film, The Painter-tailor, which is very poignant as it reflects a core conversation in the film regarding the nature of surviving as an artist. And this is something that has really fascinated me in working with Sriwhana, and also closely observing the film. What does work mean at that time? It means different things in different cultures and different periods. And now for the granddaughter, and differently for the grandfather, this suggestion that her father makes that maybe he wasn't serious about his work because he's shifting into being a tailor at times. What did you make of that comment? It was humorous, and also it created a sense of the reality of the period.
Okay, yeah. So the the thing about so I mentioned how in the 1930s that people were poor, but then you have to think about Indonesia as a whole, and certainly Bali going through the Japanese occupation, being the center of conflict, and World War II was, there were battles fought on Bali, and then including in Sanur, and then going through the Indonesian Revolution, which was a really difficult struggle, that people were actually really poor, and that people didn't really, ordinary people didn't have enough to live off. So becoming a tailor was what you needed to get by, and a lot of the other fellow villagers were fishermen, or maybe they made a living from going and collecting coral for building materials, but there wasn't a way to make a living. And certainly by the 1950s and 1960s, it was pretty hard to make a living as an artist. So yeah, while there is a playfulness about his approach to art, it's also that unfortunately art is at that stage wasn't going to put food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, from what my father's told me, it was like he went from a period of making money from his art to not, and I think that was, from what my father said, quite devastating and quite difficult, but it's about survival. And he was asked to he had to make uniforms for the Japanese, and but I think, I feel like, in a way, as an artist today, I mean, I didn't know my grandfather was an artist. When I would go to Bali, there would be this painting in my room in the room that I would stay in, and it slowly over my visits came out that it was his painting. And then so I went to make the film of the painting, and then my sister showed me this photo of Claire Holtz, and I was like, wait, this is more than I thought it was. And then they were like, oh, there's paintings of him in the museum in Ubud, and I was like, it was kind of, as the film was kind of unfolding in the courtyard and working with my family, my understanding was kind of unfolding. And with that, I think, as an artist myself, and these questions of how do you survive as an artist are still really relevant. And I've always had other jobs, and I still do. And I think I really, when I, heard he was also a tailor, and that was as important, I guess, as the painting, because you need to survive. That's where the title came from. This and using the hyphen where they're both equal, the painter and the tailor, and there's no hierarchy given to one or the other. And that was something I actually really responded to and really understood, I think. Very different circumstances, of course, but
So one question I have, which is quite material, is the painting is actually made on fabric, which is why it's so light. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's just on cotton. Yep.
It's Sriwhana. Is it at all? It's as a fabric painting. I'm wondering if it's quite vulnerable in the bedroom there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
putting my museum hat on here.
I mean, what I love is, the environment is so humid, and the room is so open to the elements, and there's a ceiling fan, and the painting now is kind of quite loose, so I'd be lying there watching the painting ripple under the waves from the ceiling fan. But I did bring it up with my father, and he was like, there's a lot of people who want this painting. It's the last one the family has, and there are collections that want it, but it's really precious to the family. And he's like, why should the family not enjoy this? And and there's this really great part in the film where he talks about, you know, it's very difficult to look after a painting. It's not like a wallet that you can, something you can put in a wallet.
Yeah.
And I, you know, in a way, I think there's this acknowledgement that, yeah, the painting, it may disintegrate, but it's in the right place in the family home. And yeah, it's interesting, Adrian. There was a painting my father kept talking about that he loved, and it was one of Gusti Rondu's last ones, and it was based on the Ramayana apparently, and it had, my father describes it as like lots of monkey tails. And,
oh wow.
Yeah, and I don't know if, you know, maybe you can keep an eye out for it, because my father talked about it a lot, and he was like, I wonder where that is, and I'd love to see it again, and it seemed to mean quite a lot to him. So yeah, if it exists out, I don't know where it would be, but maybe keep an eye out for that one.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, well, what I mean, this is also, it's like a very common story when I go and meet with Balinese artists or their families, that so few have actual artworks in there still within the family. It's quite rare, and that's one of the things I wanted to do by creating the virtual museum. Things that go into museums, a lot of that is not displayed. So it's a very difficult question about how do you preserve things, how do you conserve things, and how do you make sure people still have access to them.
It's a fundamental question for museums, in particular in dealing with different approaches to cultural value, and also with contemporary work regarding just what the ongoing access might be for artists to their work, if you think about it from that point of view, to living artists and their families. Museums, it's not news to say, have typically had quite closed doors. I been thinking about that work living in the family home. The other question I had, which was about the return to the story of the painting, and I'm wondering now in Bali, this is a question just built on my own ignorance really, is how accessible are those historic stories to contemporary viewers of a painting today? Are those traditional painting practices still taught?
Oh yeah, they are. So there's one village, Kamasan, in East Bali in Klungkung, where I lived, and they really are working hard to train people to teach younger generations, and so they're there's a very big sense of mission amongst different older generations about passing that down and continuing both the way of working, but also knowledge of stories. And I think, with television and multimedia and everything, that a lot of stories are being lost and a lot of knowledge is being lost. But there are people in Bali working hard to keep some of the Hindu classics going. But one way that they do that is through theatre. So you have things like the traditional puppet theatre, the wayang puppet theatre, but then dance drama, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the paintings, that the stories are still performed, and you can still go to traditional performances and see excerpts from different narratives. So yeah, that is being continued, but there is also a sense of, we need to work hard on keeping these traditions alive.
Yes, because of that kind of density of information. I think if you lose touch with the story, you have to work quite hard to figure out, because it has such a different compositional terrain, as you both noted, than the Western painting tradition. So even accessing, beginning, ending, you know, those where the central figure, the rules are totally different. So it would be hard to regain those rules, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yep. So fortunately, though, there's lots of work being done in different ways. So there are people working on the forms of literature, like the story of the death of Boma. It's actually written in a language that we usually refer to as Old Javanese. It's a classic language with a whole lot of Sanskrit in there, but there are people working on studying that. In fact, that work has been translated into English.
Yes, I saw, yeah.
The Bomakauya, or the Bomantaka. So yeah, hopefully we academics can contribute to continuing and helping people in Bali to have access to those kinds of stories.
Fantastic.
And actually, Adrian, after because I emailed Adrian to ask where the scene from what the scene from the painting was depicting, and he told me it's from the Bomantaka. So I've actually, this new work I'm doing, I'm working with a Dalang, Kisujawa Joko Prihatin in London on a performance that is, kind of works with the Bomantaka, and but it's kind of, I guess, the continuation. So I've been reading the translation that you just showed. It's quite amazing. Hard going, but it's big.
Yeah.
And Sriwhana, was that also the song that was in Crystal Castle, or the poem that was read?
Yeah, I also mention it in the film, The Painter-tailor, as well, because what I really loved is actually in the introduction, the first canto, the poet is unknown, and the poet prays that their text becomes the temple that the god of love can come and dwell in. And the translators actually have this really wonderful description of, they kind of talk about a language temple and what it might contain. And as you read the text, it's almost like kind of, pre-French symbolist poetry or something. The colors that are used and the descriptions, they're very decorative, and it's really amazing. And so I've been thinking, this idea of a language temple.
Well, that's a beautiful introduction to the work. I wonder if either of you have any final comment or thing to say. Otherwise, we should say good night or good morning.
No, I don't think I